At the start of 2012, Mali faced an armed uprising in the north and an army-led coup in the capital Bamako, all in the space of a few months. The situation continued to decline, prompting France to send in troops early this year to stabilise the country. Since then, a ceasefire with Tuareg rebels and a relatively peaceful presidential election, as well as the arrest in November of the general who led the coup, have raised hopes that the country could be getting back on track. But following a clash between government troops and Tuareg protesters on November the 29th, the separatist group the MNLA has announced it's pulling out of the ceasefire, leading to fears that the country could implode again. I'm Layla Milana Allen, The Economist's Middle East and Africa multimedia producer, and joining me is Paul Melly, an associate fellow at Chatham House, who's just returned from Mali. So Paul, one of the key issues in Mali is the fact there are all these different groups with different relationships and different aims. Can you explain how they do relate to each other and how that makes the situation more complex?
Yes, very loosely, you've got two types of armed groups in the north who've been in action, as it were, against governments in Bamako. You have traditional Tuareg separatists or autonomists. That's groups such as the MNLA, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad. And then you also have radical jihadist militant groups. And AQMI, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the most well-known, is actually largely Algerian. But you also have a couple of other groups, Ansar Din, which is partly Tuareg, and Mujal, which is a blend of people from across the Sahara, but also with some sub-Saharan West Africans in it. And there are complicated overlaps between all these groups. You also have traditional militias that are favourable to the government or favourable to national unity. And you have sections of the Tuareg population who are not involved in the separatist movement at all. So trying to strike a balance between military action to tackle radical jihadists committed to an agenda of a terrorist attack, if you like, and political negotiation with those armed groups prepared to renounce terrorism and engage in a discussion about what kind of autonomy or decentralization might take place in the north, that presents a hugely complex challenge for the new government in Bamako.
Amnesty International just released a report detailing a lot of abuses, sexual violence and the use of child soldiers. What does that mean for the future of the country in rebuilding that social situation?
Tackling the question of abuses and the question of impunity, calling people to account for what they've done, is a very important part of the reconciliation process that will have to take place if Mali is to re-establish durable peace in the north. The Malian army has a rather poor human rights record over decades against periodic Tuareg uprisings and movements. Malian soldiers have committed abuses. But there are also detailed allegations of abuses committed by Tuareg fighters belonging to some of the autonomous groups. The jihadists seem to have actually committed fewer abuses in the random sense of the word, as random criminality, but of course they imposed very fierce, horrific Sharia punishments on populations in the northern towns who didn't share their very fundamentalist and conservative social codes. And then the situation's further complicated because in Bamako, the soldiers who had taken power in March 2012, they at certain times also committed abuses. And that's an issue that's really come to the fore last week with the arrest of General Amadou Haya Sanogo, who is the soldier who led the putschists and who really was a major power player in Mali through most of last year and into the early days of 2013.
Several of the leaders who were involved in the coup in 2012 are still involved in the government now. So how do you reconcile the fact that many of these people seem to have been responsible for atrocities and need to be brought to justice with the fact that this is a government that the international community needs to work with? Do you think that the arrest of General Sanogo is the start of that?
Yes, it's going to be a rather complicated challenge because in a way, Sanogo represented an easy target because although he hadn't opposed the restoration of democracy, he hadn't sort of wholeheartedly participated in it. But as you say, there are people who still occupy senior positions in the system and who could potentially be accused of connection with the human rights abuses. That's why it's particularly important that Mali pursues a fairly rigorous legal process, and the question of who gets called to account for the abuses, probably to some extent, will depend on the progress of the allegations against Sanogo.
And in terms of the political outlook for the country, hopes are high after a relatively peaceful presidential election in July, and then we had a parliamentary election at the end of November, and there's going to be a runoff on December 15th. But the turnout at that parliamentary election was only 38.4%. So why do you think people didn't vote, and what will that say about the legitimacy of that government after the runoff election?
Well, there's actually a rather long tradition in Mali of low election turnouts, despite the fact that democracy commands pretty broad general assent among the population. We're in a reasonably good position in terms of re-establishing the political system at this stage, I think, because President Keita, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, was elected with a massive majority in the second round, 77%, and his main opponent, Soumaïla Cissé, conceded defeat straight away. So there was no argument about the presidential election, and he has a very strong moral mandate. The legislative election as well, the first round has passed off fairly well, apart from the difficulties up in Kidal, which were inevitable really. But elsewhere it's quite striking that turnouts in the towns in the north that had been under jihadist occupation were pretty high, which shows how much people want to get back to normal politics.
That all sounds very positive, but in terms of the MNLA withdrawing from the ceasefire, how do you think that's going to affect the future for Mali?
It's not really a key long-term development. What's much more important is that the government faces a huge challenge in trying to develop a negotiating structure, a form of talks and eventually a settlement that embraces all the diverse groups in the north.
Paul Melly, thank you very much.
You're welcome.